The dawn broke over Henderson Field like a wound opening across the sky. Captain James Mac McAllister stood at the edge of what had been, just 12 hours ago, the only operational airstrip on Guadalcanal. Now it looked like the surface of the moon. Crater after crater, each one deep enough to swallow a jeep, pockmarked the coral runway. Twisted pierced steel planking jutted from the earth at impossible angles, bent and torn like tin foil. The acrid smell of cordite still hung in the humid tropical air, mixing with the ever-present stench of rotting vegetation and fuel. Somewhere in the jungle behind him, a bird called out, a sound absurdly cheerful against the devastation. Mac was 32 years old, a civil engineer from Pittsburgh who'd spent the Depression building bridges across Pennsylvania. He'd joined the Navy Seabees thinking he'd be building roads behind the lines. Instead, he'd found himself on this godforsaken strip of coral and jungle 900 miles from anywhere that mattered, where Japanese bombers came every night like clockwork to destroy whatever his men built during the day. But last night had been different. Last night, the Japanese had sent everything. Betty bombers, Val dive bombers, even Zero fighters loaded with small bombs, all coordinated in a systematic effort to crater every inch of the 3,800-foot runway. They'd succeeded. Henderson Field was destroyed. And in 6 hours, at 0800, Colonel Merritt's squadron of Marine Wildcats was due to arrive from Espiritu Santo, 28 fighters that represented the only chance of holding this island against the Japanese fleet assembling to the north. Without Henderson Field, those Wildcats would have to turn back. Without those Wildcats, the 1st Marine Division would be overrun within a week. Mac's hands shook slightly as he lit a lucky strike. Not from fear, he was too tired for fear, but from the caffeine. He'd consumed 8 cups of battery acid the Marines called coffee in the last 4 hours, trying to think his way out of an impossible problem. Behind him, he heard boots crunching on coral. Lieutenant Fisher appeared, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. The kid was 24, fresh from Purdue's engineering program, and he'd barely slept since they'd landed on this island 3 weeks ago. "Sir," Fisher said quietly, "the men are waiting." Mac turned to look at his unit. 73 Seabees from the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, most of them in their 30s and 40s, construction workers and heavy equipment operators who'd volunteered when they could have stayed home with draft exemptions. They stood in loose formation near 3 bulldozers, 2 graders, and a dump truck that had somehow survived the bombing. Their faces were blank, waiting for orders that would probably get them killed. Because fixing this runway meant working through the day, exposed, under the tropical sun. And the Japanese held the jungle less than a mile away. And Japanese artillery had the range. And even if they survived that, the bombers would return tonight to finish the job. Mac dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. His throat felt tight. "Here's the situation," he said, his voice carrying across the silent group. "This field needs to be operational in 6 hours. Not repaired, operational. That means we need a usable runway long enough to land Wildcats, which means we need at least 2,000 continuous feet of surface that won't collapse under landing gear." He paused, watching their faces. Nobody moved. There are 47 craters across this runway. Each one is between 8 and 15 feet across. Standard protocol says we fill them with coral, compact it, lay new PSP, and resurface. That process takes, on average, 40 minutes per crater. He let the math hang in the air. We don't have 40 minutes. We barely have 6 hours. A murmur ran through the group. Someone coughed. Mac heard a bulldozer engine ticking as it cooled in the early heat. "So we're not going to do it the right way," Mac continued. "We're going to do something that's never been done before. We're going to build a runway out of the craters, not in spite of them." The murmuring stopped. Fisher stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "Sir, I don't understand." "The craters are roughly evenly spaced," Mac interrupted, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. He'd sketched it out during the night, working by flashlight in his bunker while the earth shook from artillery fire. If we can't fill them, we bridge them. We use the PSP we have left, about 900 sheets, to create span bridges across each crater. We anchor the edges with coral fill and timber supports. We essentially turn each crater into a culvert. He looked up, meeting their eyes. "It's insane, sir," Fisher said slowly. "The weight distribution will be marginal." "I know." Mac's jaw tightened. "But a Wildcat fully loaded weighs about 7,500 pounds. PSP is rated for twice that if properly supported. We're not building for permanence. We're building for one landing sequence. After that, if it holds, we can reinforce it properly." Chief Petty Officer Dutch Koenig, a 48-year-old foreman from Detroit who'd built half the automotive plants in Michigan, spat tobacco juice onto the coral. "You're talking about building a runway that's more hole than ground," Dutch said. His voice was flat, stating fact, not challenging authority. "Yes. In 6 hours. 5.5 now." Dutch looked at the cratered field, then back at Mac. Something shifted in his weathered face, the look of a man accepting an impossible task because the alternative was unthinkable. "We'll need to work in teams," Dutch said. 3 craters at a time. Dozers to shape the edges, hand crews to set the supports, PSP teams to lay the planking. He paused. "And we'll be sitting ducks for the whole morning." Mac nodded slowly. "I know. I've requested air cover from what's left at Fighter Strip 1, but they've only got 4 serviceable Wildcats. We're on our own." The silence stretched out. In the distance, a howitzer shell whistled overhead, Japanese artillery ranging shots, probing. It exploded somewhere near the beach, a dull crump that shook the ground. Finally, Seaman First Class Bobby Martinez stepped forward. He was 19, from El Paso, and he'd lied about his age to enlist. His hands were wrapped in dirty bandages from handling hot metal the day before. "When do we start, Captain?" Mac felt something catch in his chest. He looked at these men, these bridge builders and road pavers, these civilian contractors in Navy dungarees, and he understood that they'd already made their decision. They weren't warriors. They were builders. And they would build, even if it killed them, because that's what builders did. "Right now," Mac said. "Dutch, divide them into 6 teams. I want crews on craters 1 through 3 immediately. Fisher, you're my engineer. You'll calculate the load distribution for each span as we go. Nobody works alone. If the artillery starts, you get to cover, you understand? We can't afford casualties." "Sir." Fisher hesitated. "What if we can't finish in time?" Mac looked at the eastern sky, where the sun was climbing through layers of tropical haze. Somewhere beyond that horizon, 28 Wildcats were already warming up their engines, preparing for a 3-hour flight to a runway that didn't exist. "Then those pilots ditch in the ocean," Mac said quietly. "And the Marines die on this island. And we lose Guadalcanal. And the Japanese control the Solomon Islands supply route for the next 2 years. He picked up a shovel leaning against a bulldozer and handed it to Fisher. "So we finish. One way or another." The bulldozers roared to life, their diesel engines shattering the morning silence. Mac watched his men move toward the cratered runway, tools in hand, and he felt the weight of command settle across his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd never led men in combat. He'd never asked anyone to die for his decisions. But this wasn't combat. This was engineering. And engineering, Mac had learned in Pittsburgh during the Depression, was about solving impossible problems with insufficient resources and no room for error. It was 0230 hours. The Wildcats would arrive at 0800. 5.5 hours to build a runway out of holes. The race against dawn had begun. The first crater was 18 feet across and 11 feet deep at its center. The bomb had struck at an angle, tearing through the coral surface and exposing the darker volcanic rock beneath. Standing at its edge, Mac could see fragments of pierced steel planking embedded in the crater walls like broken teeth. Dutch Koenig brought the D-7 bulldozer to a shuddering halt 5 feet from the rim, the tread spitting coral dust. He'd driven bulldozers for Ford since 1932, and he handled the machine like it was an extension of his own body. Cutting the throttle to idle, he leaned out of the cab. "Captain, if we're bridging this, we need stable edges. Right now that lip is just broken coral and loose rock. First Wildcat hits this with 12 tons of momentum, it'll collapse like sand." Mac nodded, already moving. "Shape a 3-foot apron on each side. Grade it down to 30 degrees. We'll pack it with crushed coral and timber cribbing. I want it solid enough to hold the PSP edge plates." "On it." Dutch throttled up and swung the blade down, beginning to carve away the unstable crater edge with brutal efficiency. Fisher appeared with 6 men carrying wooden surveying stakes and a bundle of hemp rope. "Sir, I've marked out the trajectory line. If we keep the center span exactly perpendicular to the runway axis, we can use standard 10 by 4 PSP sheets. But the approach angle has to be shallow, no more than 5 degrees, or the landing gear struts will bottom out." "Show me." They moved along the crater's southern edge while Fisher explained his calculations, sketching angles in the coral dust with a stick. The math was sound, Mac realized. Barely, but sound. If they could maintain the support structure at 8-foot intervals, the PSP would distribute the weight across the crater span rather than loading a single point. It was the same principle as a suspension bridge, just applied horizontally and at insane speed. "How many timber supports per crater?" Mac asked. "Minimum 6. Optimally 8. Fisher wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of coral dust across his face. "But sir, we only have about 200 lengths of dimensional lumber in the supply dump. Most of it's already being used to shore up the bunkers." Mac did the math silently. 47 craters. 8 supports per crater. That was 376 pieces. They had 200. "We use 4 per crater," Mac decided. "Double up the center supports, single posts on the edges. And we augment with coral fill, pack it dense around each post to distribute the load." "Sir, that's cutting it extremely." "I know. But we work with what we have." Mac turned to the work crew assembling nearby. "Martinez, get your team down into that crater. I need 4 vertical posts set at the positions Lieutenant Fisher marks. Sink them at least 4 feet into the substrate. I want them solid." Bobby Martinez, despite his age, had grown up working his father's construction business. He grabbed a pickaxe and started down the crater's slope without hesitation, 3 other Seabees following. Within minutes, they were hacking into the volcanic rock at the bottom of the crater, their pickaxes ringing like bells in the morning heat. The work fell into a brutal rhythm. Dutch would shape the crater edges, grading the approach and exit slopes to Fisher's specifications. Then Martinez's crew would set the timber posts, driving them deep and plumb true, while another team mixed quickset concrete from their dwindling supply to anchor the bases. Meanwhile, a third crew would be cutting and fitting the PSP sheets, drilling holes for the connector pins that would lock the planking together across the crater span. It was 0300 hours when the first artillery round came in. Mac heard it before he saw it, a whistle that started high and dropped into a shriek. Everyone froze for a split second, an instinctive calculation of trajectory happening in every brain simultaneously. Then Dutch was shouting, "Cover!" and diving off the bulldozer, and Mac was hitting the ground beside a coral berm, his hands over his head. The shell exploded 200 yards short of the runway, in the jungle perimeter. Trees erupted in a spray of splinters and smoke. Then silence, broken only by the settling of debris and someone's harsh breathing nearby. Mac lifted his head. His ears rang. "Everybody okay?" A chorus of shouts confirmed no casualties. Mac stood slowly, brushing coral dust from his dungarees. The Japanese artillery spotter had them ranged, but he was firing blind through the jungle canopy, probably from a position on the hills to the south. Still, it was only a matter of time before they walked the fire onto the runway itself. "Keep working," Mac shouted. "Artillery means they know we're here, which means they know what we're doing. We can't stop." The men climbed back to their positions, but Mac could see the tension now, the constant glancing at the jungle, the way hands moved a little faster, a little less precisely. Fear was its own kind of enemy. By 04:15, they had finished the first 3 craters. Mac walked the length of each span, testing the PSP with his weight, jumping on the center sections to check for flex. The planking gave slightly, more than he liked, but it held. The timber posts creaked but didn't shift. It would work. Maybe. "Teams rotate," Dutch called out. Charlie team on craters 4 through 6. Alpha team on water and rations. Baker team on PSP prep. Mac grabbed Fisher's arm as the lieutenant moved past. "Status on material?" Fisher consulted his clipboard, shielding it from the sun. PSP holding at about 640 sheets remaining. Timber down to 162 pieces. Concrete mix almost gone, maybe enough for 10 more craters. After that, we're packing posts with straight coral and hoping for the best. Fuel for the equipment? Bulldozers have maybe 3 hours left. Graders already running on fumes. Mac looked at the runway stretching ahead. They'd completed 3 craters. 44 to go. It was 0420. 3 hours and 40 minutes until the Wildcats arrived. The math was impossible. "We're not going to make it," Fisher said quietly. "Not all 47 craters. Not at this pace." Mac stared at the cratered runway, his mind racing. Fisher was right. Even working at maximum speed, even if the artillery held off, even if nothing broke down, they couldn't do it. Not the whole runway. Unless... How long is a Wildcat's landing roll? Mac asked suddenly. Fisher blinked. Roughly 1,200 feet at combat landing speed, maybe 1,500 if they're heavy. And we've got 3,800 feet of runway total. Yes, but sir, it's cratered across the entire. Not evenly. Mac pulled out his sketch again, studying the bombing pattern. Look. The Japanese concentrated their hits on the center 2,000 feet. That's where they knew we'd been operating from. The far northern end has fewer craters because it's closer to our AA guns. And the southern end has fewer because that's where their bombs fell short. Fisher leaned over the paper, his eyes widening. "You're saying we don't fix the whole runway. We fix a landing corridor. One continuous stretch, 2,200 feet long, from the northern approach to midfield. That gives them enough room to land and roll out, even heavy. The rest." Mac gestured at the southern half of the runway. "The rest can stay broken. We'll mark it with barrels so pilots know where the safe zone is. But taking off again. They'll have to taxi to the northern end and take off from there. It'll work if we mark it clearly." Mac did the math again. 23 craters in the northern corridor, maybe 24. That's half what we were trying to do. That's possible. Fisher stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "It's still going to be tight, sir. Everything's tight." Mac turned and shouted across the worksite. "Dutch, change of plans." Over the next 15 minutes, Mac reorganized the entire operation. They would abandon the southern half of the runway entirely, concentrating all resources on the northern 2,200 feet. Every man, every piece of equipment, every sheet of PSP would go into building one perfect corridor. It was a gamble. If the pilots didn't understand the markings, if they landed long or came in at the wrong angle, if anything went wrong, Aircraft would cartwheel into the uncompleted southern section and the whole thing would end in fire and death. But it was the only gamble they had. By 0530, as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, they'd completed 12 craters. The work crews were moving like machines now, each man knowing his role without instruction. Dutch would grade a crater edge, Martinez's team would drop in and set posts, the PSP crew would slide the planking across and pin it down, and then they'd all shift to the next one, the whole sequence taking just under 20 minutes per crater. Mac stood at crater 15, watching Bobby Martinez work at the bottom, his young face streaked with sweat and dirt. The kid was swinging a sledgehammer to drive a post, putting his whole body into each blow, and Mac realized that Martinez hadn't stopped for water in over an hour. "Martinez," Mac called down. "Take a break." "Almost got it, sir." Another swing. Another inch deeper. The post shuddered but held firm. That's when Mac heard it. A different sound, cutting through the industrial noise of the worksite. A sound that made his blood freeze. Aircraft engines. Multiple aircraft. Coming from the south. Everyone heard it at the same time. The worksite went silent except for the idle bulldozer. Mac shielded his eyes and scanned the sky, his heart hammering. It was too early for the Wildcats. Way too early. Fisher appeared beside him, binoculars in hand. He glassed the southern sky, then lowered the binoculars slowly, his face gone pale. "Betty bombers," Fisher said. "3 of them. They're coming back to finish the job." The Japanese had returned to ensure Henderson Field stayed dead. The 3 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers came in low over the jungle, their twin engines droning like angry hornets. Mac could see them clearly now. Dark green and brown camouflage, the distinctive cigar-shaped fuselages, the rising sun insignia stark on their wings. They were perhaps 2 miles out and descending, lining up for a bombing run along the length of the runway. Exactly where 73 American Seabees stood exposed on open coral. "Air raid!" someone screamed, though everyone had already seen them. Men were running for the tree line, for foxholes, for anything that might provide cover. A bulldozer engine roared as Dutch abandoned his machine and sprinted toward a drainage ditch. Mac stood frozen, doing the math in his head. The bombers would be overhead in less than 2 minutes. They'd pattern bomb the runway again, destroying what little his men had accomplished and killing anyone who didn't reach cover. And even if everyone survived, even if they got back to work immediately afterward, the new craters would put them hours behind schedule. The Wildcats wouldn't land. The Marines would lose their air cover. Guadalcanal would fall. "Captain!" Fisher was shouting at him from a foxhole. "Get to cover!" But Mac wasn't moving. He was staring at the bombers, then at the runway, then at a thought forming in his mind, a thought so desperate and insane that even considering it felt like madness. Unless the bombers didn't complete their run. Unless something stopped them. Mac spun toward the far end of the runway where the Marine air defense was positioned. 2.50 caliber machine gun emplacements, undermanned and low on ammunition, but still operational. The gun crews would be focusing on the bombers already, but from their position the angle was poor. The Betty's approach path would keep them mostly out of effective range until they were almost overhead. But if the bombers could be forced to break formation early, Mac started running. Not toward cover, but toward the communications bunker at the runway's edge. His boots pounded on half-finished PSP planking, then on loose coral, then he was diving through the bunker entrance as Fisher screamed his name. Inside, the radio operator, a kid named Stevens from Nebraska, looked up in shock. "Sir, there's bombers." "I know." Mac grabbed the radio handset. "Get me Fighter 1. Now." Stevens fumbled with the dial, static crackling from the speaker. Outside, Mac could hear the bomber engines growing louder, that terrible droning that meant death from above. "Fighter 1, this is Henderson Engineering," Mac gasped into the handset. "Do you have any operational aircraft?" Anything that can fly? A pause. Static. Then a voice, calm and southern. Henderson Engineering, this is Captain Joe Foss, Fighter 1 Actual. We've got 3 Wildcats fueled and armed. But we're at least 4 minutes from intercept. What's your situation? 4 minutes. The bombers would be overhead in 90 seconds. 3 Bettys inbound on Henderson Field from the south, low altitude, bomb run configuration, Mac said rapidly. We've got 70 personnel exposed on the runway with no cover. We need an intercept now. Another pause. Mac could hear voices arguing in the background of the radio transmission. Then Foss came back. Henderson Engineering, we can't make it in time. Get your people to cover. I repeat, seek cover immediately. Mac closed his eyes. 90 seconds. Maybe less now. He made his decision. Fighter 1, disregard standard intercept. I need you to come in from the north, low and fast, straight down the Henderson Field runway. Make it look like you're landing. If the Betty crews see Wildcats on approach, they'll break off. They won't want to get caught slow and low with fighters nearby. Silence on the radio. When Foss spoke again, his voice was tight. Son, you're asking me to bring fighters in hot to a bombed-out runway we can't possibly land on, while enemy bombers are overhead, on the off chance it might make them abort their run? Yes, sir. That's the dumbest idea I've heard all war. Mac's throat was dry. Through the bunker entrance, he could see the bombers clearly now, perhaps a mile out, their bomb bay doors opening. Men were still running for cover, tiny figures against the coral wasteland. Captain Foss, Mac said quietly, if those bombers complete their run, this runway is finished and so is Guadalcanal. But if they break off, if they abort just once, we might finish the field in time. We're close. We're so damn close. He could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that followed. Then Joe Foss laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound. Well, hell, son. I always wanted to land on a runway made of craters. Fighter 1 flight, this is lead. Form on me, full throttle, heading 185, deck level. We're going to make the dumbest approach of our entire careers. Mac dropped the handset and ran back outside. The Bettys were perhaps half a mile out now, beginning their final approach. Mac could see the bombardier in the lead aircraft, probably hunched over his Norden bombsight, lining up the crater-marked runway in his optics. In 30 seconds, those bomb bay doors would release their loads, perhaps 15 to 20 bombs per aircraft, enough to undo everything his men had accomplished and kill half of them in the process. 20 seconds. Mac cupped his hands and screamed toward the jungle. Incoming friendlies from the north. Hold your fire. Wildcats inbound. The .50 cal crews wouldn't hear him, but he screamed it anyway, hoping someone would relay the message before those gunners saw American fighters and opened up. 15 seconds. Then Mac heard it, a new sound, higher pitched, coming from the opposite direction. 3 Grumman F-4F Wildcats burst over the northern tree line at full throttle, maybe 50 feet off the ground, their Pratt & Whitney engines screaming at maximum power. They were in a tight Vic formation, so low that their prop wash was kicking up dust from the damaged runway surface. The lead Betty bombardier must have seen them at the same moment. Mac watched the bomber's nose suddenly pitch up, the aircraft climbing sharply, its bomb bay doors still open but no bombs falling. The pilot had aborted, breaking off the attack run rather than risk being caught vulnerable by what looked like defending fighters. The other 2 Bettys followed suit, breaking formation and climbing hard to the east, their engines straining. The 3 Wildcats screamed down the length of Henderson Field at 200 knots, so low Mac could see Captain Joe Foss in the lead aircraft's cockpit, his hand raised in a crazy salute. Then they were pulling up, climbing hard after the retreating Bettys, their .50 caliber wing guns already chattering, tracers reaching out toward the fleeing bombers. Mac stood in the center of the runway, his legs shaking, watching the dogfight develop in the eastern sky. One of the Bettys was trailing smoke from an engine. The other two were jinking desperately, trying to gain altitude where their superior speed might save them. Dutch appeared beside him, breathing hard. "That was—" he started, then couldn't find words. "That was stupid," Mac finished. "That was so stupid it might have just saved us." Fisher came running up, his face flushed. "Sir, one bomber got through. It dropped its load over the southern end before breaking off." Mac's stomach dropped. "Casualties. Checking now." "But sir, the southern section." "Doesn't matter." Mac grabbed Fisher's shoulders. "We were already abandoning it, remember? We only need the northern corridor. That's still clear, right?" Fisher nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Yes, sir. The working area is untouched." "Then we keep going." Mac raised his voice, projecting across the runway where his men were emerging from cover, shaken but unhurt. "Everyone back to work. We've got 2.5 hours. Charlie team on Crater 16, Alpha team on PSP prep, Baker team on." A massive explosion cut him off. Everyone dropped instinctively, but the blast was distant, out over the water, to the east. Mac looked up in time to see a fireball falling from the sky, trailing black smoke. One of the Bettys had gone down. A ragged cheer went up from the Seabees. Martinez was pumping his fist. Even Dutch was grinning. But Mac was looking at his watch. 0550 hours. 2 hours and 10 minutes until the Wildcats arrived. 23 craters completed. 11 more to go. "Back to work," he roared, and the celebration died instantly. They returned to the craters like men possessed. The near-death experience had burned away the last reserves of caution, replacing it with something harder and more desperate. Mac saw men taking risks they shouldn't take, standing too close to swinging bulldozer blades, scrambling down crater walls without ropes, lifting timber that should have required 3 men with only 2. He should have stopped them. Should have enforced safety protocols. But there was no time for safety, no margin for caution. There was only the work and the clock and the knowledge that 28 pilots were already airborne, committed to landing on a runway that still didn't exist. At 0640, they lost the first bulldozer. The D-7 Dutch had been operating all morning finally ceased, its engine smoking and knocking before going silent. Dutch climbed out, patting the machine's side like an old horse being put down, then moved to one of the remaining dozers without a word. At 0705, Bobby Martinez collapsed. He'd been working for 5 straight hours without break, and his body simply gave out. Mac ran to him, rolling the kid over, checking for heat stroke. Martinez's eyes fluttered open. "I'm okay," he gasped. "Just need a minute." "You need water and rest," Mac said firmly. "You're done." "No." Martinez struggled to sit up, failed, tried again. "No, sir, we're too close. I can work." Mac looked at this 19-year-old kid who'd lied about his age to wear a uniform and build things in places where people were trying to kill him, and he felt something break inside his chest. "You've done enough," Mac said quietly. "More than enough. Take a break." "That's an order." Martinez nodded weakly, and 2 of his teammates helped him to the shade. By 0730, they were down to 8 craters remaining. Mac could see the finish line now, could see the nearly continuous stretch of bridged craters and patched sections that formed the northern landing corridor. It looked insane, like something from a fever dream, this runway that was more air than ground, held together with PSP and prayer and the desperate skill of American builders. But it was there. It was actually there. "Sir." Fisher was running toward him, the young lieutenant's face streaked with sweat and coral dust. "Sir, we've got a problem." Mac felt his stomach drop. "What problem?" "Crater 31. The bomb hit at a bad angle. It's not round like the others, it's elongated. 28 feet long. We don't have enough PSP to span it. We're short by at least 6 sheets. Mac ran to the crater and immediately saw the problem. Fisher was right. This wasn't a standard crater. The bomb had skipped or tumbled before detonating, creating an oval gouge that would require 40 feet of PSP coverage instead of the usual 15. How much PSP do we have left? Mac demanded. Fisher checked his clipboard. After completing the remaining craters? Maybe 12 sheets. We need 18 for this one. Mac stared at the crater. It sat right in the middle of their landing corridor, impossible to avoid. Without bridging it, the entire northern section was useless. He looked at his watch. 0734. 26 minutes until the Wildcats arrived. Can we fill it? Mac asked. The old-fashioned way, with coral? Not in 26 minutes. That's a massive crater, Captain. It would take. Then we narrow the landing corridor, Mac interrupted. We don't bridge the whole crater, we bridge half of it. Create a 12-foot wide pathway right down the center. The Wildcats have a track width of about 9 feet. If the pilots stay centered, they'll hit the bridged section. Fisher's eyes widened. Sir, that's asking pilots to thread a needle after a 3-hour flight with minimal fuel. If they drift even 3 feet to either side. I know what I'm asking. Mac's voice was flat. But it's this or nothing. Make it happen. He walked away before Fisher could argue, his hands shaking. He'd just designed a runway feature that violated every engineering principle he'd ever learned. A narrow bridge across a crater, with no margin for error, no room for pilot error or crosswinds or combat damage to landing gear. It was, in the most technical sense possible, insane. But they were building it anyway. The final minutes ticked away as men worked beyond exhaustion to finish the impossible.